Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Caroline Freund, Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego, and the school is most commonly known as GPS. So I'm probably going to say GPS a lot, so just so you know what that means. We have a number of faculty-led research centers and programs that focus on creating solutions to global policy problems. And today's event is organized by two of our centers, the 21st Century India Center and the 21st Century China Center. GPS has long been known for our work on China, where we have a number of scholars working on issues related to Chinese political and economic systems, as well as US-China relations. And in the last few years, we've also developed considerable expertise on India and launched this India Center. And we're working to identify policies that support economic competitiveness and US-India trade and investment relations as well. So over the last 2 decades, both China and India have ramped up policy efforts to establish themselves in the production chain of clean energy equipment. China's initiatives have led to dominant positions in the market for solar. I think they're like 80%. I'm sure Michael can correct me if I'm wrong, of production in solar, wind, rare earth materials, and electric vehicles, where of course they're also soaring. And meanwhile, India's efforts to establish domestic manufacturing capacity are developing. So in this research project, Professors Teevrat, Garg, and Michael Davidson have been examining this evolving relationship and interactions of trade and industrial policies in developing these sectors. Teevrat is an associate professor of economics at GPS, where he heads the Energy Transitions Initiative at the 21st Century India Center. He's an expert on climate adaptation, decarbonization, and energy transition. He's also the co-founder of Powder Technologies, a solar enterprise focused on scaling demand response in emerging economies. Michael Davidson is an associate professor joint with GPS and the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department in the Jacobs School of Engineering at UCSD. He leads the Power Transformation Lab, which focuses on engineering implications and institutional conflicts inherent in deploying low carbon energy at scale. Besides work on India, he's also a faculty member with the 21st Century China Center. So I'm going to invite audience questions through Zoom, and you may use the Q&A feature. We also have excellent panelists, and I'm going to wait to introduce them till after the presentations. So please go ahead, Michael.
Great. Thanks so much, Caroline. Sharing my screen here. Okay. So we're really excited to share some preliminary data and descriptive findings from our work on what we're calling the agenda on renewable energy trade between India and China. I think the motivation, as we've already heard, is that China has become dominant over the last 2 decades in clean energy manufacturing, including solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, and mineral inputs to these key technologies. And India wants to decarbonize and build domestic industry as it scales up its own climate ambitions. Here, the challenge is that Indian firms are currently not globally competitive. We're showing here the global market share across various PV component chains, as well as wind supply chains. And so in the extreme case, China has over 95% of the global market share in some PV components, and still quite large in other components with the wind chain. And that's shown here also in EVs and batteries and minerals and many other components of the clean tech supply chains. So India has ambitious targets to achieve net zero by 2070, and then by 2030 to deploy large amounts of non-fossil and renewable energy capacity. And it's also in a unique geostrategic position in that it's hoping to build on the broader trends and efforts from international partners, including the United States, for alternatives to China's supply chains. These go under various names, de-risking or friendshoring. And India has a potentially unique position here to both be a manufacturing powerhouse, but also a friend, partner, or even ally of some of these other countries trying to de-risk from China. Now, what are the potential effects of combining a large-scale manufacturing push with clean energy deployment? Well, on the one side, policies such as tariffs or local content requirements could increase the cost of deploying clean energy, and that could delay India's transition by raising the cost of these alternative resources, which are already cheaper than fossil resources in most contexts. On the other hand, building a strong manufacturing base in India, as in other countries, can create continued durable political support for clean energy deployment. And then because India is so large and such an important test case, India's success or ability or inability to achieve these twin goals will have pretty wide implications for the rest of global clean energy markets. And as we look at how many other countries, including in Southeast and South Asia, are thinking about growing domestic manufacturing of clean energy, India's success could have many important lessons to be had. So if we just wanted to look at briefly what types of interventions is India adopting to help achieve these twin goals. Well, first off, solar has been a major target of policy interventions. And this is due to the fact that India has historically been extremely reliant on imports of Chinese solar goods to achieve various solar targets. So these interventions include local content requirements, which is that a minimum share of various products must be produced domestically in order to satisfy certain conditions, either to achieve subsidies or to qualify for certain auctions. There's also production-linked incentives, again, tied to local production. There's also been lists of approved models and manufacturers, which give a leg up to local firms. We've also seen other sectors such as electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, green hydrogen, and others begun to see incentives for domestic manufacturing. And if we look at the policy interventions over time, they are growing. And this is a figure from the white paper where we're tracking the policies over time just on China's clean energy products by category. And one thing I'll note is that various import policies are significantly growing in recent years. So tariffs are a very important element of these policies, and they are particularly high for electric vehicles and for solar. Now, EV tariffs range up to 125%. This is true across conventional vehicles as well, but EVs face very high barriers to entry. Solar components have also faced pretty ramping solar tariffs over time. And so just plotting those components, one thing you'll see here is that over time we've seen particularly the solar PV module, which is the final assembled component, go from a very low tariff level to a very high tariff level. So taxing the final end-use product in the hopes of bringing more of that assembly and eventually upstream manufacturing to India. So our effort here, broadly, what we're thinking doing in this white paper and also where our continuing efforts are, is to understand a few things. One is to establish a baseline of how the intermediate and final goods of these clean tech products are traded between India and China and the rest of the world. and what types of policies is India using to diversify away from China. Even this baseline of data sets is still relatively lacking in the broad academic literature and public domain. Two is to explore all the available, evaluate the available data sets that have been used. And we're very fortunate to have on this call some scholars who have used granular data sets to investigate the effects of trade policy. And three, develop accompanying research questions. And what are the most relevant policy and research questions for facing India's policymakers as they try to meet these twin goals? Briefly, we have more details in the paper, but here's a brief table of some of the selected data sets and papers that we examined for this report. There are quite a few different databases out there that collect data on a variety of scales. One thing that I will just highlight here is that there is a significant common use of UN Comtrade data, so these sort of globally traded data sets at a certain HS6 code level, and we'll be using some of that here in this talk. But also there are significant gains to be had by collecting directly the customs data from Chinese customs and Indian customs agencies to get more granular product level that we can get at the component level. And in addition, we've collected, assembled a pretty large policy database as well of India's, combining together various resources of India's trade and substitution policies. So the top line here is that the China to India clean energy trade has gone through wild swings and is under increasing pressure as a result of these interventions. And I think there's a really important policy and research questions here. So first off, if we go back to sort of the earliest phase of local content requirements in solar, 2014 to 2017, over this time, we saw India actually dramatically increase its imports from China in solar goods. And then in the later phase, when there was greater import taxes as those were increased, and then additional local content requirements and policy interventions, we saw a steep decline in solar imports from China, but then growing post-COVID, and then to the more recent imposition of even higher import taxes and solar panels, we saw this really large seesaw pattern where we're seeing multiple times differences over a span of a few years in terms of the import value of solar. Other goods are more steady over time because the pair of policies have not been as variable. And importantly, by looking at some of these component levels, we can also examine intermediates. And so India has been a large importer of intermediate PV goods, in particular PV cells for assembly into PV modules. This is a place that ASEAN, Southeast Asia, has also taken on as a role as it imports PV cells from China, assembles them into modules, and exports them to other countries around the world. India has also played this role, though it's increasingly trying to move away from even importing those PV cells and trying to move further upstream. And then at the same time, we're also examining how India's exports have been picking up in wind and solar. And you'll notice here the purple line is solar. We saw over this period increasing tariffs on China, as well as a scrutiny on China inputs from other countries, notably Southeast Asia, as if China's intermediates go to assembly manufacturers in Southeast Asia for export elsewhere. This has increased the attractiveness of India, but it is really important to note that in 2024, 97% of solar exports went to the United States. So it's a very heavily dependent on currently on the US market, which, as we know, is highly volatile in the current administration. So the policy and research questions that we're interested in getting into, and what we have an excellent panel here to discuss, is first is what are the relative effects of trade policies, considering tariffs versus industrial policies, subsidies, or incentives on clean energy trade? Second is, how is India balancing this tension between rapid deployment of clean energy as well as its goal of building indigenous manufacturing? Third is, what can we learn from local content requirements from other contexts, including China, and the development of competitive indigenous industries. And then more forward-looking, which sectors is India most likely to gain global manufacturing foothold? Where is the potential competitive and comparative advantage for India, and what is necessary to accomplish that? So I will close here. The white paper can be found on the india.ucsd.edu webpage, and I'll pass it back to Caroline now.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that excellent and very clear presentation of what's happening in the solar industry around the world, and especially in India and China. We have an outstanding panel of experts to reflect on this research and also help us to understand the key questions that you raised. I'll first introduce the panel and then move to questions. Professor Shrath Garg is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania. His research is at the intersection of industrial organization and development economics. In his recent work, he studied the solar industry, the cement industry, and agricultural sector. So he's very well placed to talk about this work. Rishabh Jain is Senior Program Lead at Council on Energy, Environment, and Water in New Delhi. His expertise revolves around critical minerals and renewable energy deployment, supply chain, and manufacturing. He has worked with major business, governments, and is supporting various Indian ministries for the G20 Energy Transition Working Group. So again, perfectly placed to discuss this. Dr. Ilaria Mazzucco is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington. She has extensive experience researching industrial policy, Chinese climate policy, and the intersection between the energy transition and economic national security. And finally, Peter Wooders is a senior sustainable energy expert and co-founder of the Geneva Platform for Resilient Value Chains, an NGO focused on helping reduce clean energy supply chain risks and issues. He was the first director of the energy program of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So as you see, we have China expertise, India expertise, and solar and renewable expertise. So excellent panel. So I'm going to invite each of the panelists to provide introductory remarks and to include reflections on some of these key questions raised by the research. So, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. First, Shrath, is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
Help us understand the policy and market drivers of trade patterns. What are the relative effects of trade policies, tariffs versus industrial policy on clean energy trade? And I'm going to make an aside here that as a trade economist, my advisor was Jagdish Bhagwati. So I won't say that my views are very far on one side, which you can probably guess on this, but I'll be curious to hear what you have to say. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Caroline. So let me start by going over some empirical evidence we have on how trade policy and subsidies directly shape trade in renewable energy, and then I'll talk about some conceptual issues. Okay, so let me start with this paper. So this is joint work with Sagar Saxena, and in this paper, we are looking at the Indian solar module manufacturing industry. So on this graph, I have two time series plots. The one in blue is the market share held by foreign producers, and these are by and large Chinese producers. The red line are domestic producers, and this vertical black line is the first date in which import duties were implemented. And as we can see, this policy was successful in shifting market share from foreign producers to domestic producers. Now, of course, this was somewhat successful in onshoring. That's not always the case. So it obviously depends on how these policies are designed. So here I take an example from the US. So this comes from Bollinger et al., and they are looking at the US trade policy in the same industry. In this graph, we have three kinds of firms. the firms, the data in red are firms that are based only in China. The data in blue are firms that are based in both China and rest of the world. So you should think of these as firms which are headquartered in China, but may have production facilities in other parts of the world. And in green, you have firms that are outside of China. And if you, for example, look around the 2014 line, so this is when a major revision in the tariff policy against China and Taiwan was imposed by the US government, you see this shift of trade from firms that are based only in China towards firms that are headquartered in China but may have production facilities elsewhere. So again, this tells us that trade policy can be successful in shaping manufacturing patterns, can be successful in shaping trade patterns, but it really depends on how the policy is designed. So that's tariff and trade policy. Coming to subsidies, we don't have as much work thinking about how subsidies affect manufacturing and trade patterns. So for this, I have used data from or a figure from the shipbuilding industry, but I think the findings here should be qualitatively similar. So this is the global shipbuilding industry, which is dominated by 4 players. So you have China, Europe, Japan, and South Korea. Chinese government started subsidizing the shipbuilding industry starting in 2004. And what we see is right around that time, the industry takes off and it takes a lot of market share from other dominant players, in particular Europe. So all these 3 examples illustrate that both tariff policies and subsidies can be used to shift trade patterns. The question is, what's the relative costs and benefits of these 2 instruments? So if I were to sort of classify these 2 policies and think about the welfare effects, we should think about 3 players that a domestic government might care about. So it cares about itself. So think of the fiscal revenue or the fiscal outlay associated with these policies. It cares about domestic consumers, and it cares about domestic producers. If we start with tariffs, tariffs are good for the government because it generates revenue. It's bad for consumers, increases price. This is good for domestic producers because it reduces competition. Production subsidies are the opposite. So they are bad for the government because it has to pay those subsidies. Good for consumers because it tends to reduce prices, and good for consumers because it's a fiscal transfer. So both of these policies have different trade-offs. And just in the paper I have with Sagar, we sort of characterize what the optimal policy is if we want to expand domestic renewable manufacturing. And what we find is that the optimal policy really depends on what your objective is. So if you want to achieve a small expansion in the domestic industry, so you want to expand your industry by a small size, tariffs alone are sufficient, so just rely on tariffs. If you have a large, ambitious target, maybe you want to combine both tariffs and subsidies. So this tells us, depending on what our target is, what the policy should be. Now, what the target is, of course, depends on the country and the industry in question. We run our analysis for the Indian solar industry. There we find the target to be 8%. So if you want to expand your industry by less than 8%, just use tariffs. If your goal is anything larger than 8%, you should be combining both these policies. The Indian government definitely has goals above 8%, and that is maybe why we see a combination of all of these policies being deployed in this sector. In the last couple of minutes, let me talk about some more policies that we see governments using. So the first one, which Michael already talked about, are these domestic content requirements. And this is essentially this is a set of policies which require solar plants to use domestic modules. So we use data from 2016 to 2021 to figure out what the impact of these policies are. And what we find is that these policies increase prices that solar plant developers charge by roughly 7 to 10%. So these are not costless policies. These do increase downstream prices. So we can put these in the framework that we had before. So we just add a third column. DCRs are great for the government because they don't require any fiscal outlay. They're bad for consumers because, as we just saw, they tend to increase prices. They're good for producers because they increase the demand for their product. We don't have results so we have results which combine tariffs and subsidies. We don't have results which combine all three. That's maybe something for future research. Let me just end with mentioning a couple of other policy instruments that we see governments using when thinking about industrial policy. And this comes from a paper by Barwick and co-authors. So they look at a bunch of policies, including the ones that we have already discussed. But in addition, they have these two additional instruments. So these are investment subsidies and entry subsidies. Investment subsidies, you should think of these as subsidies given to existing incumbent players to expand capacity. And entry subsidies are subsidies given to new firms who want to set up, say, new manufacturing plants. And one of the takeaways from their paper is that entry subsidies can potentially be wasteful because the kind of firms that they attract are these marginal firms who are induced by these subsidies to enter the industries. And these might be small, inefficient firms. Production and investment subsidies are better because they are well targeted. They tend to go to these firms which are already present, which have already shown that they can survive in this industry. So these are production and investment subsidies by design are well targeted. Of course, we need to care about concentration and market power as well, but this gives us one additional mechanism that we need to keep in mind when designing policies. So let me stop here and happy to take questions if any.
Thank you. That was excellent. I think we'll go through all the presentations and then take questions. But while we do, I'll say I was thinking about the policy China used, which is, foreign direct investment, joint ventures, and technology transfer. So maybe just think about that, or maybe some of the others will talk about that. So next to Rishab, help us to understand the interactions among trade policy, prices, and deployment. How is India balancing the tension between rapid deployment of clean energy technologies and its goal of building indigenous manufacturing capacity? Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Teevrat and Michael also. Fantastic presentations and discussions. Couple of things that I would want to highlight. Of course, Shresht and even Michael have already put out a lot of analysis and very interesting information. But India has been trying to support or build domestic solar module cell manufacturing capacity in the last 15 years. So it's not very recent trend. We actually started working on setting up solar cell manufacturing, if I remember, somewhere around 2008, 2009, where the Chinese cell manufacturing was also very nascent at that point in time. And there were companies that had ordered machineries, mostly from Germany, to start manufacturing cells in India. Unfortunately, around that time and after the global recession itself, what happened was because there's so much focus on manufacturing in China, it was like a hockey stick in terms of what China necessarily wants to manufacture. And of course, solar was one of the sectors that they really wanted to focus on. And then at that particular time, there was no possibility for any country across the world to compete. So there have been instances where companies had ordered these machines, but they did not necessarily have the money to even unpack it. So for 5 to 7 years, there were machines wrapped in plastic, lying in warehouses, cell manufacturing just there, because it did not even make sense for them to give the last tranche to the machinery operator who would come and then train these people itself. So many of these companies had gone bust itself. So, but beyond that, what we saw was the India came up. Sorry, I'm giving some context because it is helpful and why are we here and what has our learnings been. And then around 2010, India came up with the National Solar Mission. The focus there was completely on deployment. It did not necessarily talk about manufacturing significantly. It said that we need to install 22 gigawatts of solar by 22 itself in 2010. Of course, we have achieved way more than that. And then to do that, the solar module cost, and given that manufacturing did not necessarily exist, a lot of those solar module came from China and actually from America. And what we did was, because there's so much incoming module that was coming, the first barrier that India implemented was not actually, it was DCR with a twist where it said that DCR is only required for crystalline solar module. So there was no DCR that was required for thin film module. And India around 2010 to 13 was the country which had the ratio of crystalline to thin film completely opposite what existed across the world. So majority of the modules that were deployed in India were completely thin film, because the domestic manufacturer said that you need to focus on you can allow only non-crystalline products. So we saw that. So there was a loophole in the policy, which meant that a lot of the thin film modules started coming in. Then, of course, there was in WTO, we lost the case with US in terms of DCR. So DCR was gone. But then what we started seeing rapidly until 2016-17 was significant reduction in prices. And that, of course, led to all the manufacturing shutdown in Europe and other parts of the world. And this then led to so much rapid deployment of solar. So recently we crossed 108 gigawatt, and thanks to the reduced prices of solar modules. The lowest we achieved was 1.99 Indian rupees per kilowatt hour. That is unimaginable for Indian policymakers, and that was always considered a great point in India's energy transition, such low tariffs. But at the same time, the Indian manufacturers were struggling. This is before COVID. And so India implemented anti-dumping. There was investigation, but no implementation of anti-dumping duty. But there was a safeguard duty that was implemented a couple of years. Again, there were loopholes, did not necessarily materialize because there were countries where we had signed FTAs. But it was only after COVID, and I want to stress on this, it was only after COVID when across the world, including India, the government realized that we have to do everything to support domestic manufacturing, and we have to close loopholes wherever required. And that is where there are three important policies. Some, of course, have been discussed. One is we have basic customs duty very high, 40 and 25% on solar cells and solar modules and solar cells. We had ALMM. I think ALMM is the reason why we have domestic manufacturing. It's not tariff. It is not the subsidies. It is not the production linked incentive scheme, which is the $3 billion support that has been given to Indian manufacturers. The only reason is ALMM. And now what is ALMM? ALMM is basically a DCR policy which says that any module that will be sold in India needs to be ALMM certified. While it is a certification mechanism, essentially it says that unless and until you are as part of that, you'll not be there. So I think it's a mix of different mechanisms, but the local content requirement was the biggest winner.
Thank you so much for that excellent context. You raised a number of issues, including taking into account China's response and the price trajectory in China, because tariffs may work, but if China's price is falling extremely fast, they stop working, and you end up with all this idle capital. And also the importance of regulations and standards in these industries where they differ around the world, and whoever sets the global standard has an advantage, and setting your own standard can really hurt you. That was great. So next to Ilaria, help us to understand the effectiveness of local content policies. How effective are local content requirements in supporting development of competitive indigenous industries and their vulnerability to trade disputes? And what can we learn from China's experience? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And before I do so, thank you for having me on this excellent panel. And also congratulations to Michael and Teevrat and the rest of the team. I mean, this is a very interesting paper, super interesting project. I am looking forward to reading more. And let me just say, this is a very dynamic area, the India-China relationship when it comes to clean energy, and India's experience with industrial policy and developing its own clean energy is definitely something that's moving very quickly. And I think we should all be paying attention to. So I would like to commend them for picking the topic and for working on this. In terms of local content requirements, which I think everybody has been sort of pointing to and bringing up, I think the paper points out that this is, that the results have been very mixed in India. And I think that's true for most countries globally, right? And a lot of countries have used local content requirements in clean tech and also other areas. Brazil, United States, Indonesia, China. And I would say, that it's clear that this is a tool that theoretically can be very useful. In some cases has been very useful, but it's clearly not sufficient in and of itself to achieve the development of a new industry or upgrade an industry itself. In some ways, I think it could be comparable to tariffs, right? Where having only tariffs and no other policy can be limiting, I think, to the development of an industry, and certainly in solar, I think we've seen that to a certain extent. Now, if we do look at different countries, different elements that seem to be important are policy continuity. That's certainly something that's been very present in China. And I think certainly been very, something that we'll be looking out for in the United States, a case study perhaps for the future, now that the, parts of the Inflation Reduction Act have been, overhauled. And so that's going to be, so that's certainly an important signal for investors, if nothing else, right? That there are going to, the incentives or the requirements are going to be in place for a certain amount of time. The second element is that demand needs to be quite strong. So local content requirements only really work when you are leveraging your internal market. Right? So if you are a very small country with very limited demand, it's going to be very hard for local content requirements to actually work. Now, India, of course, has this potentially huge market. So it could potentially work very well, but that requires, sort of continued leverage of this growing market. And that's something that China, of course, did very well. Local content requirements were used most extensively in the wind industry very early on in China. In ways that I think most would say were fairly successful in attracting foreign direct investment. But I think the third element that's really perhaps the most important one is that you need to have an ecosystem that's going to be responsive enough in scaling and reducing costs in manufacturing. If you don't actually have a manufacturing base or the capabilities or the companies that are going to be responsive, then it's going to be quite difficult to create sort of you can't just will an industrial production out of nowhere, let's put it that way, right? And so that's really sort of from, I think, conceptual standpoint, another important element. Now, of course, India has various elements of these things, but they still need to work together because, of course, I think as the previous panelists have pointed out, there are costs attached to this, right? And there's a cost differential, and there's a real question of who's going to pay for that cost differential, right? Who are the consumers? And what are the targets ultimately of this policy, right? Is it a cost differential that makes sense for geopolitical or national security concerns? Is there sort of a long-term industrial development target? And if that's the case, then is there a date by which, if you haven't achieved it, you give up on it, right? And so I think these are all sort of difficult questions for policymakers to keep in mind. But I think it's worth mentioning. I think, Caroline, I want to thank you for bringing up FDI and joint ventures in China. Because it in some ways, again, somewhat similar to, in some ways, this is part of the local content requirement solutions, right? You could have localization of foreign firms. And this has had, even in China, if you look at the automotive industry, right, internal combustion engine industry, it didn't actually work all that well for China. Until the EV transition, China really wasn't an innovator when it came to the automotive sector, despite having plenty of joint ventures and foreign direct investment from foreign companies. So I think that's sort of a warning sign that even for China, these policies have worked only in very specific conditions and are worth sort of analyzing more closely. This is something that I've been repeating a lot in Europe, where there's a lot of enthusiasm about technology transfer through joint ventures, right? And I think it requires a little more than just having a joint venture. You do need to have a broader ecosystem that's actually sort of enabling that diffusion of technological of manufacturing know-how and all the other things that actually are enabling sort of scaling and the cost advantages. So I think I'll leave it at that. I will just note, yes, one last point is the global reaction to this, and I think we are very much in a sort of a global governance and flux on trade. And so I think there are certainly a lot of these practices were far more problematic a few years ago. Then I think today you're seeing much more a proliferation of these policies. And it's not clear that the WTO or other institutions are necessarily well equipped to address that. And I think more broadly, there's probably going to have to be at some point some recognition that a new sort of governances or agreement across countries of what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable will be necessary at some point. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. And you raised so many important points, especially I think about the continuity and predictability of policy, because that's one of the features of China that has worked so incredibly well, is having policy that stays in place, is predictable, because you're not going to get an investment response if you don't know what policy is going to be in place tomorrow, which is certainly a problem in the United States right now. I think also the market size and demand. And there's one additional thing I would want you to think about, which is I've read that in China, one of the things that's worked really well is creating competition among the different provinces. And I don't know if India has thought of doing that, but maybe they have all these interventions, so they're protected from the rest of the world, but there's such a big market, they have that, but they also can create that kind of internal competition, and lots start, but only the best actually end up growing. So great discussion. And thank you also for bringing in the multilateral system. I think you were very polite about the WTO, and I think it certainly is not in any shape to address these issues, and hopefully we get something new. Finally, to Peter, help us understand India's global competitiveness in clean energy manufacturing. So this is really critical, because if you incentivize an industry where you have no chance of being competitive, you're just throwing all that money away and consumers are suffering. So in which sectors is India most likely to gain a global manufacturing foothold? What's necessary to accomplish this? Please, over to you.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and also to the paper, just to highlighting this China-India relationship, which I think doesn't really get the attention it deserves. I think the first point I'd make is how different is India to other countries of the world at the moment? And when we look at the clean energy, the major clean energy sectors, let's say this is effectively solar, wind, critical mineral processing, batteries, and EVs. Now, if you're almost any large country in the world, with as we've noted here today, a large domestic market giving you space to enact some policy to build your own industry and so on. What are you seeing at the moment? You're seeing incredible competition from Chinese manufacturers. The capacity is very high. The capacity to export is very high. Prices are low. Prices in solar, for example, in the first half of this year for most of the major Chinese manufacturers, so sort of the big 10, if you like, who are the biggest 10 in the world in manufacturing terms, in very simple terms, they're not making money at the moment. There is so much competition, as you referred to, Caroline, there, with the interprovincial competition, with the availability of loans and finance and refinance mechanisms and so on from different provinces, from different local governments in China, that it's created a situation where we effectively have very, very large capacity and people selling at cost. So the barriers to entry for any country are very, very high at the minute. And I think, again, sort of following this theme of, is India very similar to other countries again? What are you trying to do in these industries? First, you're trying to secure your supply of the goods in the first place. And I think for India in critical minerals, that's the stage it's at. It's firstly to make sure that there is enough imports. Following that, you're then looking to produce as much as home as you can across the manufacturing supply chain. And I think one of the factors we haven't pointed out today is, when you look at, for example, the solar manufacturing chain, that goes from polysilicon to wafers and ingots to cells to panels. India has basically zero production at the moment of polysilicon and wafers and ingots. It has about a quarter of what it needs in cells, and it's getting towards self-sufficiency in panels. It's not a dissimilar situation to the US. US is a bit more polysilicon, but also it's short in the other intermediate stages. So you are reliant on imports of those intermediate inputs, which can be fairly finished products. In some cases, when we look at a cell, that's 2/3 of the value of a panel. If you can then do the wrapping around and the encapsulants and the structures and so on, you add another 20%. The assembly is another 5-10% after that. So again, India is in a similar position to a lot of the other countries in that it's at the end of the value chain. It's looking to build up its domestic manufacturing. It's hoping that will then lead to exports. And I think one thing we haven't perhaps looked at enough today is, given these huge barriers of entry, but given that also the countries around the world want more supply chain diversity, they want to be buying from more sources, they want more different routes. That means that there is considerable incentive for companies to be set up in India or other countries around the world with investment from India or from other countries from the world or around the world, or both, to specifically to be more diverse than the current market will supply. But that more diversity will come with extra cost, and as was noted by previous speakers, somebody has to pay that extra cost. So if we want more supply chain diversity, somebody has to pay for that. Is that government? Is it consumers? Is it a combination of the two? Some good experience there from the US solar panel industry, which solar panels in the US have been 20% more expensive than the rest of the world since the tariffs first came in 2012. In simple terms, they're paying for diversity, i.e. local production. Where does this lead us? Where could India be competitive going forward? I think it's already competitive in wind and in many of the components that are required in that, the gearboxes and some of the other elements, and is exporting to Europe and to other sort of major advanced markets. It's got, in relative terms, a large solar panel industry compared to other parts of the world. And now it's got a national mission for critical minerals and is looking to build up through that. And there are resources and the ability to set up processing plant there. But I think we have to change our mindset a little bit and say, if you want to get to a position where you're competitive with the market, i.e. Chinese producers, you might be waiting a very long time. And industrial policy in the past, as Ilaria was mentioning, you would put in industrial policy with the idea of setting up sustainable firms within 5-10 years or whatever it might be. I think we might have to wait a lot longer than that now, and maybe we never get there. And so if we want our diversity, I think there's a different way here of looking at success. If there are parts of the market that are willing to pay premium for diversity, for local content, for whatever, then that's what countries like India can aim at, and other countries. To be thinking you're going to be purely competitive with China is a big, it's a big ask, and it's going to be very, very difficult. And then we see, there are opportunities that come up from time to time in the market. And as noted, India's been importing panels recently, last few years, and exporting panels mainly to the US to take advantage of it having a lower tariff than its main competitors. The huge tariffs that went on to some of the Southeast Asian countries recently on solar panels still gives India an advantage in this place. So there may be opportunity as well to sort of work around the tariff game and see where there's possibilities of going into countries with high tariffs.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter, and for really pointing out the excess capacity in China and what that means for trying to be competitive in these industries. One of the questions that came up in the chat was exactly about what you leaned into, which is on the value add as opposed to looking at exports and imports. And what I heard from you is that there isn't a lot in solar, but there is in wind. Do you have a sense of what it is in wind and other industries, just staying with you for a moment?
Yes, certainly. I think the same general point applies, that Chinese competition in all of these goods, in all of these sectors, is very, very strong. And that if countries want to build up their capacity, they may have to use protective measures as well, or set up premium or whatever it may be. There's a lot of intermediate components where India is strong in terms of the gearboxes, some of the pitch equipment, sort of good mechanical, electrical, electronic engineering across wind. And I think that goes generally for a lot of countries and a lot of companies in the wind sector, that there are opportunities sort of away from the very high-tech side of this, which companies can exploit.
Great, thank you. The second question in the chat is about environmental regulations on clean energy in China and India. And of course, having environmental regulations also raises the cost and encourages investment when you're a big market like China or India into those sectors. Has anybody thought about those and their effects and want to comment on that?
I can quickly come in, Karan. So, couple of points. One, in India, at least specifically, and I will not talk about China. There's enough that is already said in terms of the impact on environment on some of these, specifically in China. But in India, what is happening right now, there's a lot of focus on domestic module manufacturing, which is also very assembly kind of thing. There's mostly it's a fully electrified facility. So in terms of if your source of electricity is fairly clean, which it can be, and most of these companies are using clean power from the grid, then there's very limited environmental implication. There's not a lot of utilities. But for cell and then after wafer, ingot, polysilicon, there are a lot of utilities like water, air, because these are very energy intensive processes. And I think internally how the country works for any manufacturing to come in, there are certain norms that are set by the pollution control boards in that region. So like any other industry, they need to meet those regulations. And if they are within the limits, they'll be able to operate. So there's no specific or any relaxation that is given to solar manufacturing or even recycling. And sometimes those are also barriers for entry in manufacturing in India, unlike in many other regions, in China also, where we have seen some of these regulations are not necessarily met. And those are something that manufacturers often keep talking about, that how do we relax these, because it is making us difficult with so many regulations to be competitive with our counterparts internationally.
Yeah, here in Southern California, we apparently have a huge deposit of lithium, but the environmental regulations are such that it would not be cost effective to extract it. So very related to this topic. The next question is about the effect on the grid. And I thought, Michael, you might be able to talk a bit about this with your engineering background and what kinds of demand solar is good at filling and how it affects the grid.
Sure, yeah. I think that in the long run, India is going to have to deploy a large amount of battery storage to make the solar work. In the short run, I think it's premature. I think where generation shares are in India and China and many other economies, batteries are not that necessary to integrate solar. But I think it really points in the long run that most models show there's a high correlation between solar and battery deployment as we get closer to net zero. So I think this really points to how India is going to be able to build up its own battery supply chain, distinct from China. We didn't show the statistics, but China is also 80% of the global battery module market, upstream even higher if you look at some of the cathode anodes, other materials, graphite, et cetera. I think that's going to be the sort of the next frontier if we think about where some of these clean manufacturing targets are going to have to really bite. And that plays into grid storage, but also to electric vehicles, where electric vehicles, by some estimates, is going to be 10 times the storage requirements of grids as we go out a few decades. And so there's a lot of potential policies here that India might be trying to deploy and learn from from some of these earlier cases in solar.
Excellent, thank you. And the last two questions I'm going to combine, which are about circularity, and especially as we're thinking about competing with China, maybe given that China is so far ahead on the kind of original critical mineral side and manufacturing side, there is a competitive edge to get in on the recycling reuse side for other countries, which will be critical for the future. So it's kind of innovation in that sense. So how do we think about that? So let me turn to Rishabh, who has his hand up, and then that'll be the last question since we're coming to the end, and I'll give you all a moment for any closing remarks as well.
Thank you, Caroline. Just quickly, unlike manufacturing, where it may happen typically wherever the costs are lowest, it's impossible for recyclers, or even it's very difficult for the modules, basically of the larger size, to go to the same place, shipments, because of the cost, emissions, etc. So anyways, the recycling, and it may be a very small sector, anywhere in the world, has to happen domestically. At whatever scale, and you do not necessarily need a lot of huge quantity to recycle. Now there are two challenges with that. One, most of the modules or a lot of these technologies, including EVs, batteries, are not designed to be circular. So it's very difficult, and it's a very energy intensive process to actually take out the minerals, and what you get is not necessarily the best what you would want. So how do you, very important aspect, how do we nudge manufacturers, which then increases cost, to design keeping circularity in mind? Now in India, given the scale of deployment that we are seeing, there's a huge potential already, because we lose products in manufacturing, in transport, during installation, and then of course end of life. And we have already seen critical mass because of the concentration of deployment in few states. So there's enough that already exists. Now, this is something in terms of the evidence, and we have found a number, what those numbers are, but there are certain regulations that need to be updated, like the EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility. Whose responsibility this is? What are the minerals that can be recovered? Which are the credits that you can claim? Now, some of these are in very nascent stage in India and sometimes across the world. And I think there's enough discussion that is happening in India at this particular moment. And CW is actually very proud to say that we have been leading some of these narratives on circularity. Is what do we necessarily now do? And what is the role of different ministries? And also at the state level, municipality level, how do we support the circular aspect? So it's a complex process, because there's a local pollution control boards that are involved. There are these manufacturers, there are these collectors, the developers, the traders, everyone is there, and people need to figure out who's responsible for what, because we are talking about 25 to 30 years.
Thank you so much. I think this has been really an incredible discussion and shown both how complex these issues are, how many of the policies have unintended consequences, and how costly they can be if they're not successful, but how important they can be, especially with renewables, if they are successful. So we certainly need more work here. Let me go quickly just around the speakers if anybody wants to say anything, and then Teevrat hasn't spoken, so I want to make sure he gets closing remarks. So let's go in reverse order. So I'll start with you, Peter. Anything you want to add?
Thank you. Two very quick points. Firstly, let's not forget that this is ultimately about climate action, these clean energy supply chains. So we want as much solar and wind to go in, as many EV to be built. Although countries also want local manufacturing and supply chain preferences, we need the climate action. And I think that leads as well to the situation we don't want here is very strong industrial policy competition at national level. So where can we look for collaboration in terms of regional industrial policy, in terms of global industrial policy in these sectors? And what are some of the compromise solutions that might work there? For example, outward investment from China, bringing jobs to countries while transferring the technology as well. Of course, that depends on attitude and willingness, but there are some compromise solutions out there.
Excellent. Thank you. Important point. Ilaria.
I think Peter made some brilliant points there. I will just add that I think we've talked a lot about solar. We've talked a little bit about EV and batteries, but I think, moving forward, it will be interesting to sort of see on batteries and on next generation technologies how these sort of, tensions between climate priorities, industrial policy priorities, but also, the synergies between this, how this all plays out. These obviously being, batteries being far more strategic from a national security standpoint as well. So I think that those are just going to be really interesting topics, and I'm looking forward to following the team's work on this.
Thank you, Ilaria. Risha.
Yes. So I would say for the last I mean, until 2024, we were talking about manufacturing specifically for local jobs as China plus one, diversification, and local value add. But I would say in the last 3 to 6 months, the reason to build domestic manufacturing has completely changed. We have seen what has happened to India right now, and we have been put on tariffs because we are dependent on oil from Russia. So this means that tomorrow, for any geopolitical conflict between two countries where India is not necessarily a party to, you can be penalized. A country independently, India can be penalized. So potential conflict between India, US, and China or any other can say that because you import so much solar modules from China, I would put a tariff barrier or whatever tariffs on you. So now it's not only between China and India, which was always the case because they are not necessarily best friends, but a third country and a very important partner has put. So everything is now vulnerable, and not just them, but China, because they've recently put a ban on rare earth magnets. So we were dependent. We did not necessarily build an ecosystem. The magnets are very costly. We have the technology, but manufacturing, but then suddenly it's cut out. And the auto sector in India is one of the largest contributors to India's GDP. So a small magnet can have tremendous impact on India's economy. India lacks and lacks of jobs. So I think beyond all of these, including competitiveness, so if we have to even pay a premium on solar modules, that premium, the whole price is still very less than coal. So we have to start comparing not what is the benchmark price of solar modules across the world, but a benchmark price which is typically lower than coal and any other gas, and then say that even if it is manufactured in India, a technology that may not be the latest, it's okay. And solar module that was made in 2023 with the technology will still work for 25 years. So it's okay. We don't have to worry for the latest tech. We should make peace and then focus on energy transition, but maybe in a way that we are reliably comfortable that, okay, in 2030, whatever may happen in the world, we can deploy solar modules in the country. So I think that thinking has now happened. And that is where the government will also be doubling down.
Excellent. Thank you for bringing in the geopolitical risk and the unfortunate high tariffs on India. Shrav.
Yeah, let me briefly talk about joint ventures. And I guess Ilaria had some comments about the Chinese automobile industry and how joint ventures impacted or shaped that industry. So there's this interesting paper by Jia Bai and co-authors, and they look at what impact this had. And what they found was that while it may not have led to, at least during the ICE, the internal combustion engine age, it might not have led to Chinese producers becoming global leaders as they are in the electric segment. It did lead to those firms improving their quality. So there was some learning going on. And the mechanisms that they identify are, one, there is some employee learning going on. So these employees, they work in these factories and then they move to other factories, and that's really beneficial. And the second thing is that having these joint ventures bring in global suppliers who supply to these factories, and Chinese domestic manufacturers can use these global suppliers. So I guess I would say that there is definitely a role for using joint ventures to promote domestic manufacturing.
Thank you. So we've had a great discussion about the need for more cooperation in these important areas, decarbonization being critical for the world, geopolitical risk, and then the tension also with jobs. So there's a lot of different goals trying to be achieved with these policies. Teevrat, the last word, over to you.
Thanks, Carolyn. I just wanted to take a moment to thank everybody. I think the unenviable job of summarizing the whole panel, but I'll try to do that as quickly as I can, which is, I sort of saw three main themes emerge from this. The first being that the geopolitical tensions that are existing, reforming, ameliorating over time are going to rapidly reshape what the business environment for domestic manufacturing in India is going to look like. And this is going to come in the form of both opportunities for Indian manufacturers, but also challenges through third-party conflicts, as Rishabh was pointing out, has taken place more recently. In the context of this, I think what we really need is, the kind of work that a lot of the people on the panel have been doing, what Shreyat was alluding to, that there's the impact of these different policies, while, sort of from a theoretical standpoint might be similar, the actual the actual implementation of these policies, because of the way existing industries are shaped, because of the way challenges or interactions are happening across national borders, either through joint ventures or through retaliatory measures, that's going to mean that the domestic policies that are implemented are going to matter quite a bit. And I think alluding to what both Peter and Rishabh and Ilaria were saying, which is that the actual capacity of the domestic market, even beyond clean energy, just the general competitiveness of the manufacturing sector is also going to play an important role. And I think finally, I think just taking cue from the panel was that we need to just rethink what a win in this setting looks like. I think that, to me, really struck out as one of the best arguments for how we're going to rethink and think about this agenda going forward, which is it doesn't necessarily mean a price per price market competitiveness. The innovation that China is doing, not just, it's not just the manufacturing superiority that China has, but they're also the leader now in patents around a lot of the solar deployment. And I think that ability to create that innovative environment for the next generation of technologies might be someplace where India might look for a comparative advantage. I just want to, we're about 5-6 minutes ahead of time already. So I just want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Michael for leading the discussion. And of course, Caroline, thank you so much for moderating this panel and all of these experts. For more information, please, feel free to meet us at our website on the 25th Century India Center, where we will post this entire video. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
And I
you.
look forward to continuing the discussion on these important topics. Great discussion.
Thank you.